I still can't understand why he chose to do it that day. It all seemed so innocent at first glance. My name is Alice, and this story turned my life upside down. It all started with one simple request. James, just don't go into my room. But why couldn't he stop himself? Why that day? I can still picture the first time I met James. He was charming, almost too charming. My sister Sarah had brought him home for the holidays, glowing with excitement. "This is the man I'm going to marry," she announced. And why wouldn't she? He was tall, with sharp blue eyes and a disarming smile. Everyone in the family adored him. Everyone except me. It wasn't that I hated him. No, hate would have been easier to deal with. What I felt was unease. James had a way of looking at me that didn't feel right. It wasn't overt or obvious, but his lingering glances, the way his eyes followed me when Sarah wasn't looking, it was enough to put me on edge. Still, I brushed it off. After all, he was Sarah's husband-to-be, and I trusted her judgment. But as time went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that James was testing boundaries. It started small. A joke that felt a little too personal. A hand resting on my shoulder just a moment too long. I convinced myself I was overreacting. He was family now, and family doesn't cross lines like that, right? The day Sarah and James moved into the guest house on our family property was the beginning of the end for me. It was meant to be temporary. A place to stay while they saved for their dream home. First, it was nice having them around. Sarah and I had always been close, and having her so near felt like old times. But James started getting bolder. One afternoon, I came home early from work. I was tired, frustrated, and just wanted to collapse in my room. But as I approached my door, I noticed something strange. It was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I never left my door open. Slowly, I pushed it open and froze. James was standing there, holding something in his hands. My journal. The air seemed to leave the room as I stared at him, unable to speak. He turned to me, and instead of looking embarrassed or apologetic, he smirked. "You have some interesting thoughts in here, Alice," he said, his voice calm and measured, as though he wasn't invading my privacy. "What are you doing?" I managed to choke out. My voice sounded foreign, like it belonged to someone else. He shrugged, flipping through the pages like he was reading a novel. "You left it out." I was curious. I knew that was a lie. My journal had been buried under a stack of books on my desk. He had gone looking for it. "Put it down. Now," I demanded, my voice trembling. James raised an eyebrow but obeyed, setting the journal back on the desk. "Relax, Alice. I didn't read much," he said with a smirk that told me he was lying again. The worst part? I knew exactly what he had read. The journal wasn't just a place for me to vent my frustrations or scribble my thoughts. It was where I wrote down everything. My fears, my insecurities, and my doubts about the people around me, including James. And worse, it was where I had confessed something I never wanted anyone to know. The fleeting, shameful moments when I found myself drawn to him. It wasn't something I was proud of. I hated myself for even thinking it, but writing it down felt like my only escape. Now he knew. As James walked past me, he leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear. "Don't worry. Your secret's safe with me," he whispered before leaving the room. I stood there, shaking, staring at the door he had just closed behind him. My mind raced with questions. Why did he do it? What was he planning? And most importantly, how was I going to face him or Sarah after this? That night I barely slept. I replayed the scene over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it. Was he toying with me? Testing me? Or was it something more sinister? The next morning, Sarah greeted me with her usual sunny smile, completely oblivious to what had happened. I couldn't bring myself to tell her. How could I? How do you tell your sister that her husband had just shattered every boundary? That he was invading my space? Not just physically, but emotionally? As the days went on, I tried to convince myself it was over. James wouldn't push further, I told myself. He had crossed a line, sure, but he wouldn't dare do it again. He had to know the risk of Sarah finding out. But deep down I knew better. This was only the beginning. I came home from work, ready to forget the day and bury myself in my thoughts. But the moment I saw the door to my room wide open, my heart dropped. And then I saw him, standing there, like it was nothing. After that first invasion, things didn't go back to normal. How could they? Every time I saw James, it felt like he was holding something over me. A silent game where only he knew the rules. I tried to convince myself that it was my imagination, that maybe I was blowing things out of proportion. But the way he looked at me now, it wasn't my imagination. It didn't stop. One evening, Sarah and I were sitting in the living room, sipping wine and laughing about some childhood memory. James walked in, casual as ever, but his eyes found mine immediately. His gaze lingered just a moment too long, and I felt my stomach tighten. "You two having fun?" he asked, leaning against the doorway, that familiar smirk playing on his lips. "Of course," Sarah replied, oblivious as always. "Want to join us?" James shook his head. "Nah, I'll let you two catch up. But don't stay up too late, Alice. You've got an early start tomorrow, right?" It was a harmless comment. At least that's how it would have sounded to anyone else. But I knew better. There was an edge to his tone, a reminder that he'd read my journal, that he knew things no one else did. I laughed it off, pretending his words didn't bother me. But inside I was unraveling. The next day I tried to avoid him altogether. I left the house early, stayed out late, and only came home when I was sure he'd be with Sarah. But it didn't matter how much distance I tried to put between us. James was always there, in the corner of my mind, and worse, physically there when I least expected it. One Friday evening, I came home after an especially long day. The house was quiet. Sarah was out with friends, and I assumed James was too. I headed to my room, relieved to finally have some peace. But as I pushed the door open, I froze. James was sitting on my bed. My heart slammed against my chest. "What the hell are you doing in here?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I expected. He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back, completely at ease, like he had every right to be there. "Relax, Alice. I was just waiting for you." I stepped into the room, keeping as much distance as I could. "Waiting for me? Why? And why are you in my room again?" He tilted his head, studying me like I was some sort of puzzle he was trying to solve. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his tone almost accusatory. "We're family now. Shouldn't we be closer?" The audacity of his words made my blood boil. "Get out. Now," I snapped, pointing to the door. James didn't move. Instead, he stood up slowly, closing the gap between us. My instincts screamed at me to step back, but I held my ground. I wasn't going to let him see me flinch. "You're so serious all the time," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's exhausting, you know? Always acting like you're above it all. Like you're not curious." "Curious about what?" I shot back, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. He smirked. "About me." The air between us felt heavy, suffocating. I wanted to scream, to shove him out of my space, but my body betrayed me. My hands trembled at my sides, and I could feel my resolve slipping. James took one step closer, and I finally snapped. "Get out." I shouted, my voice echoing through the room. This time he obeyed. But not before leaning in just close enough to make my skin crawl. "You're no fun," he said, his voice dripping with mock disappointment. "But okay. I'll go. For now." I watched as he left the room, closing the door behind him. My legs gave out and I sank onto the bed, shaking with anger and fear. What was his end game? Was this just a twisted game to him, or did he really think he could manipulate me into what? I didn't even want to finish the thought. For the first time since this nightmare began, I considered telling Sarah. But what could I say? That her husband was creeping into my room, reading my journal, and saying things that made my skin crawl? She'd never believe me. James was too smooth, too perfect in her eyes. And deep down I was terrified of what would happen if she did believe me. That night, I locked my door and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. But it didn't make me feel safe. Because I knew that James wasn't going to stop. This wasn't the end. It was only a matter of time before he crossed another line. And I wasn't sure I'd be able to stop him. I thought avoiding him would solve everything, but James had other plans. It wasn't just a game to him anymore, it was a hunt. And I was his target. James became relentless. Every interaction, every shared moment in the house, felt like a carefully orchestrated move in a game he was playing only with me. He began showing up wherever I was. The kitchen when I was making coffee, the living room when I was watching TV. Always casual, always just a little too close. "Why do you always look so nervous around me?" he asked one evening. His voice light but his eyes piercing. "I don't," I lied, forcing a smile and retreating to my room. But James wasn't deterred. He started finding excuses to touch me. A hand brushing against mine when he passed me a plate. Fingers grazing my arm when he reached for something behind me. Each time it was quick, fleeting, and impossible to call out without sounding paranoid. But I felt it. I felt everything. The worst part? A small, shameful part of me didn't hate the attention. I hated myself for it. One night I was in the backyard trying to clear my head under the stars. The air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. I thought I was alone until I heard his voice behind me. Couldn't sleep. I turned to see James leaning against the doorframe, his silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light. "What do you want, James?" I asked, my voice weary. "Nothing," he said, stepping closer. "Just wanted to make sure you were okay. You've seemed distant lately." "I'm fine," I replied quickly, taking a step back. But he closed the distance. "You don't have to pretend with me, Alice," he said, his voice low and intimate. "I get it. Life's complicated. People are complicated. Sometimes it's hard to resist." My breath caught in my throat as his words hung in the air, unspoken but heavy with implication. I felt trapped like a rabbit in a snare. And I knew that if I didn't leave, I'd be in over my head. "I should go," I said, turning toward the door. But before I could move, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "You don't have to," he whispered. I pulled away and fled inside, locking myself in my room. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. I hated him for putting me in this position, hated myself for not stopping him sooner. But most of all, I hated the tiny spark of curiosity that refused to die. I thought I had control over the situation, over myself. But control was just an illusion, one I was about to lose completely. A week passed. I avoided James as much as I could, but he was always there, lurking in the corners of my life. His words from that night replayed in my head, taunting me, tempting me, breaking me down. One evening, Sarah announced she was leaving for a work trip. "It's just a couple of days," she said, kissing James goodbye before turning to me. "You'll keep him company, right?" My stomach churned at her words. I managed a nod, but inside I was screaming. That night, the house felt heavier without Sarah's presence. I stayed in my room trying to distract myself with a book, but every sound made my pulse quicken. Around midnight, there was a knock on my door. I froze. "Who is it?" I asked, though I already knew. "It's me," James said. His voice was calm, almost casual. "Can we talk?" "No," I replied, my voice firm. But then the doorknob turned. I had forgotten to lock it. The door creaked open, and there he was, leaning against the frame, his eyes fixed on mine. "I just want to talk," he said, stepping inside. "Get out," I demanded, standing up and backing away from him. But James didn't stop. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, blocking my only exit. "Alice, you're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be," he said, his voice soft but insistent. I was shaking, but not just from fear. My emotions were a storm. A dangerous mix of anger, fear, and something I didn't want to admit. James stepped closer, and before I could stop him, his hands were on my arms, his touch gentle but firm. No one has to know, he whispered. What happened next was a blur. A moment of weakness, a decision I would regret for the rest of my life. As soon as it was over, reality came crashing down around me. I felt sick, disgusted with myself and with him. James, on the other hand, looked entirely too pleased, as though he'd won some sort of prize. "You're not going to tell her, are you?" he asked, his voice light and confident. I didn't answer. I couldn't. When he finally left, I locked the door behind him and collapsed onto my bed, tears streaming down my face. I wanted to scream, to erase everything that had just happened. But I couldn't. And I knew deep down that this was just the beginning of the nightmare. I thought I could bury it, lock it away in the deepest part of my mind and pretend it never happened. But secrets have a way of clawing their way to the surface, don't they? Especially ones like this. The morning after, I avoided James entirely. I left the house before he woke up and stayed out until I was sure he'd be asleep. But no matter how hard I tried to escape, I couldn't run from the weight of what had happened. I felt tainted, broken in a way that couldn't be undone. Every glance in the mirror was a reminder of my failure, of my betrayal. Sarah's face would flash in my mind, her bright smile, her endless trust. She had no idea that her own sister had crossed the unforgivable line. Days turned into weeks, but the tension in the house was suffocating. James didn't try to repeat what happened, but his presence alone was enough to make me unravel. "You're quiet lately," Sarah said one evening over dinner, her brow furrowed with concern. "Are you okay?" I forced a smile and nodded. "Just tired. Work's been a lot." James, sitting across the table, smirked. "Yeah, Alice has been working really hard lately. Staying out late, keeping busy. Right, Alice?" My stomach twisted as his words hung in the air, laced with meaning only I could decipher. I wanted to scream, to throw my glass at him, to do anything to wipe that smug expression off his face. But I stayed silent. That night, Sarah left the table to take a phone call. The moment she was out of earshot, James leaned closer. "You're really good at keeping secrets," he said, his voice low. "I respect that." I clenched my fists under the table. "Leave me alone, James." He laughed softly. "Relax. I'm just saying we both have a lot to lose, don't we?" The threat was clear, even if it was wrapped in his usual charm. It didn't stop there. Over the next few days, James became bolder, testing the limits of my patience. He'd make casual comments when Sarah was around, subtle jabs that only I understood. I began to feel like a cornered animal, trapped in a cage he was slowly tightening around me. And then he crossed the line again. One evening, Sarah invited a few friends over for dinner. It was a lively night, full of laughter and wine, but I could feel James watching me the entire time. When I went to the kitchen to grab more drinks, he followed me. "You're doing great," he said, his voice dripping with mock encouragement. "Almost like nothing ever happened." "Stop," I hissed, turning to face him. But he just smiled, his eyes scanning me like I was some kind of prize he'd already claimed. "You're so tense, Alice. You should really learn to let go." I wanted to slap him, to scream at him, to do something to break his smug composure. But I didn't, because deep down I was afraid of what he might do if I pushed him too far. And that's when it happened. The door to the kitchen creaked open, and there stood Sarah, her eyes wide with confusion. "What's going on?" she asked, her gaze flicking between the two of us. James didn't miss a beat. "Nothing, babe," he said smoothly, stepping away from me. "Alice was just telling me how grateful she is for everything you've done for her. Right, Alice?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She frowned, her eyes narrowing as she studied me. "Are you okay?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah was watching me more closely than usual. And for the first time I realized that James wasn't the only one holding a secret. Sarah was hiding something too. As I lay in bed that night, the weight of everything pressed down on me like a crushing tide. James's words echoed in my mind, taunting me. reminding me of the power he held over me. But what terrified me more was the look in Sarah's eyes. She knew something, or she suspected, and I had a sinking feeling that whatever she was hiding was about to explode into all of our lives. I thought I was the only one trapped in this web of lies, the only one suffocating under the weight of secrets. But I underestimated Sarah. She wasn't as blind as I thought. She was just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The days after the dinner party were unbearable. Sarah's demeanor toward me had changed, though subtly. She was quieter, more observant. She asked fewer questions but lingered longer in the room when James and I were together. It felt like she was piecing something together, and I was terrified she was getting closer to the truth. James, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed. He continued his passive-aggressive jabs, his lingering stares, his veiled threats. Every moment in his presence felt like a countdown to disaster. But then Sarah surprised me. One evening while James was out, she approached me in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand. "Can we talk?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. I nodded, my heart pounding. "I feel like there's something you're not telling me," she said, sitting down across from me. "You've been so distant lately and I need to know if everything's okay." Her eyes were searching and for a moment I thought about telling her everything. But fear held my tongue. Instead I said, "I'm fine, Sarah. Really. I've just been stressed." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. Instead she smiled faintly and said, "Okay. Just know I'm here if you need to talk." It should have reassured me, but it didn't. If anything, it made me more nervous. The next day, I noticed Sarah on her phone more than usual. Her voice hushed when she spoke, her expressions guarded. At first, I thought she was working on something for her job. But then I overheard part of a conversation that made my blood run cold. "Just make sure it's all there. I need proof before I confront him," she said, her voice tense. Proof. Confront him. She knew. That night I barely slept. My mind raced with possibilities. Would she confront James? Would she confront me? How much did she already know? I didn't have to wait long for answers. The next evening, Sarah called both of us into the living room. She stood in front of the fireplace, her expression cold and unreadable. "We need to talk," she said. James glanced at me, his smirk faltering slightly. "What's this about?" Sarah held up her phone, her grip tight. "This is about lies. Secrets. And the truth you thought I'd never find out." My stomach dropped. James laughed nervously. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" She ignored him and turned to me. "Alice, do you want to tell me or should I show him?" I froze, my mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp. She tapped her phone and a recording began to play. It was James's voice, clear as day, from one of his conversations with me. "No one has to know. We both have a lot to lose, don't we?" My heart stopped. She had recorded us. She knew everything. James's face paled, his usual confidence crumbling. "Sarah, wait. Don't you dare," she snapped, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. "I trusted you. I trusted both of you. And this is what you do behind my back." I tried to speak, to explain, but Sarah silenced me with a glare. "I'm not done yet," she said. She turned back to James. "I hired a private investigator," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "Do you want to know what they found? Your little business trips, you weren't working. You were meeting with her," she said, pointing to her phone, where a picture of James with another woman flashed on the screen. Aghast, my mind spinning. He had been cheating on Sarah with someone else, too? "You disgust me," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "Both of you." James tried to approach her, but she held up her hand. "Don't. You don't get to explain. I'm done." She turned to me, her expression a mix of betrayal and heartbreak. "You were my sister, my family, and you let this happen." I couldn't respond. There was nothing I could say to make it right. I want you both out, she said finally. I don't care where you go. Just leave. And don't ever come back. The finality in her voice was crushing. She didn't scream or lash out. She was calm, composed, and utterly broken. As James and I packed our things in silence, I couldn't shake the weight of her words. I had destroyed everything. My relationship with my sister, her trust, and any hope of redemption. But as I walked out the door for the last time, I realized that Sarah wasn't the victim I thought she was. She had been planning this moment for weeks, maybe months. And she had won. The game James thought he was playing had just been turned against him, and me. And Sarah was walking away the victor. I walked out of that house thinking I had lost everything. But I was wrong. The real punishment wasn't losing Sarah. It was facing the truth about myself and the choices I made. And the truth was far more devastating than I could have imagined. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, far enough away to avoid running into Sarah or James. The silence of my new life was deafening, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the crushing weight of guilt. But Sarah wasn't finished with me yet. One afternoon, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. Sarah and me as children smiling on the beach. On the back, written in her unmistakable handwriting, were 3 words. Remember who you were. I stared at the photo for hours, tears streaming down my face. Sarah's message was clear. This wasn't just about what I had done to her. It was about what I had done to myself. But what haunted me the most wasn't the memory of my betrayal or the fallout. It was the question that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind since that night in the kitchen. Why hadn't Sarah confronted me sooner? The answer came a week later. I was sitting in my apartment, scrolling aimlessly through social media, when I saw her post. It was a photo of Sarah, standing on the steps of a courthouse, holding a piece of paper. The caption read, "Freedom is the ultimate revenge." My heart sank as I realized what it was, a divorce decree. James was out of her life for good. But that wasn't all. As I dug deeper, I discovered the real reason Sarah had waited to confront us. She hadn't just been gathering evidence against James. She had been building a case. James had been embezzling money from his company, and Sarah had the proof. She turned it over to the authorities, ensuring that James would face not only a ruined marriage but also criminal charges. It was a masterstroke of revenge, calculated and executed with precision. And I was just collateral damage in her larger plan. But even as I marveled at her strength and cunning, I couldn't escape the gnawing sense of loss. Sarah was my sister, my best friend, and I had destroyed our bond. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rebuild my life. I started therapy, hoping to understand why I had let things spiral so far out of control. I reached out to Sarah, sending her letters apologizing, begging for a chance to make things right. She never responded. Months passed, and I started to accept that I might never hear from her again. But then one evening there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Sarah standing there, her expression unreadable. She held a small box in her hands. "I'm not here to forgive you," she said, her voice steady. "And I don't think I ever will. But I thought you should have this." She handed me the box and turned to leave. "Sarah, wait," I said, my voice breaking. "Please. I'm so sorry." She paused, her back still to me. "Sorry doesn't fix anything, Alice. But I hope you figure out how to fix yourself." And then she was gone. Inside the box was the photograph she had sent me, now framed, along with a note. "This is who we used to be. It's up to you to decide who you want to become." That night I made a promise to myself. I couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the pain I had caused. But I could change. I could become someone my sister might one day be proud of again. The truth of what happened will always haunt me. But it also set me free in a way I never expected. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself.